Hi, today I'm greeting you from my swamp, actually a dried out pond. Um, I started it 20 years ago, but due to climate change, it's all changing, and now it's less and less water in this year. Although the year is quite rainy, there is no water in this pond. But occasionally, after large rains, it is full of water, so I even have a pipe controlling the level of water, and a lot of the plants in the middle of it are marshland plants, like sweet flag and rushes and sweet manna grass. And today I wanted to talk about this particular grass, which is a forgotten wild cereal which was used in parts of Central and Eastern Europe. Its grains are tiny. Look, I took it out um, from inside the inflorescence, and they are just tiny, more than 1 millimeter, maybe 2-3 millimeters. And it's incredible that people actually ate it. So 13 years ago, I gathered a bunch of scientists to study the history of the use of this plant. One of them was an archaeobotanist, Aldona Miller-Bieniek, one historian of botany, Piotr Köhler, and one historian of Polish food, Jarosław Dumanowski. And we looked at archaeobotanical evidence, we looked at historical documents, price lists, tributes, and also documents about archives about peasant food in the 19th and 20th century. So this genus of plants contains a few species. One of them is a large grass called Glyceria maxima, but actually it has smaller grains than this species and wasn't used. What was used was definitely sweet manna grass, Glyceria fluitans, and maybe some other very similar species which were probably not distinguished, like Glyceria lituanica, declinata, plicata, nemoralis. We actually cannot tell. All the sources always talk about Glyceria fluitans, which is also the commonest of these smaller manna grasses. So what is manna? Because this genus of grasses is often called manna grasses. So manna with double N is a Hebrew word which occurs in the Bible and describes the food that was eaten by the Israelites, by the Jews, when they left Egypt and they traveled through the desert and they were starving. And one day they found that God gave them this amazing food, and we still don't know what it is. I don't want to start speculations because there are many theories. But later on, this word was sometimes used to describe some small, pleasantly tasting food, like maybe some sweet dried secretions, like from the manna ash, Fraxinus ornus, which was sometimes often called Calabrian manna, and it was even sold in Polish pharmacies as health food. It was, of course, very expensive. So even sometimes people use the word manna for little bulbils of lesser celandine, and probably in many other cases this word was used, and somehow it became the name of the grass. And also in Polish we say manna, manna jadalna, edible manna, and this was the main and practically the only name of this grass in Poland. So in the archaeobotanical part, Aldona Miller-Bieniek mentions just a few finds of manna grasses in deposits, mainly from early medieval period, which is quite strange because later it was used quite commonly. So we have a theory that it's not a kind of ancient food, because we often think of um, things which are foraged in the countryside as something which is very ancient, and maybe it's a relic of, old ancient times. Maybe prehistoric people ate it. And actually, sometimes we have vogues. We have plants which were eaten in some period and then abandoned, and they were not eaten before this period. So we have a theory that manna grass started being eaten in the feudal times, because it was quite costly to gather. I made experiments and it was very, very slow to gather. In order to gather it, it's best to go out around dawn or before dawn, when there is dew, because you gather it with big sieves, and they're like nearly 1 meter in diameter, and you thrash them around. And if there is dew, then the whole fruits, the top bits of manna just break off and fall on the sieve, but they don't shed the seed, because the seed is very small. And then you can bring it home, you can lay it on a piece of cloth and dry it. And then people would pound it in wooden mortars called stempa, and then you would shake it, and all the light parts would be taken out by the wind, and the actual the grain would stay. So that's how you make kasha, how you make groats. So it was quite fiddly to gather. The result was probably not much, maybe during a day. I can't really tell, because we don't know how these people were efficient, but I would guess it was between 100 gram, maybe a kilogram at most. And so this became a part of tributes paid by peasants to feudal lords, because manna grass is very tasty. It's quite sweet, it contains a lot of starch, and was considered tastier than wheat. So tributes in Poland were paid with various products depending on the area, and they were often, mainly agricultural products brought by peasants. Could be things that they grew, but also wild products like dried mushrooms, hazelnuts, water caltrop fruits, but also manna grass grains. Tributes were paid often on St. Martin's Day, which is in the first half of November, and the 11th of November. So this was something like closing the season. So we do have records of manna grass being given to lords, usually in quite small amounts, like probably around 1 liter per family. We also found records of manna seeds reported in the accounts of King Władysław Jagiełło and his wife Jadwiga. He was a Lithuanian guy who became the Polish king and joined Poland-Lithuania, a very famous person. So between 1389 and 1418, we have 7 records of manna being used in the accounts, and sometimes it occurs together with rice. So we were not 100% sure it was manna grass, but because it, for example, occurs with rice, which was expensive grain, maybe it was also grain, but also because rice was expensive, maybe the writers meant Calabrian manna, the Fraxinus ornus manna ash product. We don't know, and but we assumed that this was manna grass. There are many 19th century records about manna where you can buy it. There are specific towns and even cities mentioned where you can buy manna, and also some prices given. I tried to calculate them according to the price of wheat at that time, or meat. So it comes to like between 2.7 and 13 times the price of wheat, and comparable to the price of good meat. Manna was mainly used in the form of soup, although occasionally also a kind of bread was made with it. Also desserts. I also forgot to mention one thing, that manna was gathered mainly between St. John's and St. Peter and Paul's, so between the 24th and the 29th of June. We found a few records mentioning these dates, and they correspond to the real peak of fruiting of this species in Central Europe. I described the story of sweet manna grass in Poland and many other wild foraged foods in this book, Foraging in Eastern Europe. The oldest recipe for manna grass in Polish cookbook comes from 1686. Is a recipe for pancakes. Take milk, break in 3 eggs with egg whites, and add good flour until the mixture is in the consistency of cream. Take a long or round container, smear it with butter. Pour in a little of the mixture so that it creates a layer as thin as paper. With each pancake, smear with butter again and heat. Take manna, rinse it well, boil it in water with sugar and raisins so that it's not sticky. Set it aside in a bowl to cool. Put a little bit on the pancakes and roll. Put it in a bowl to fill it in. Take half a quart of sweet milk. Add 4 raw eggs with egg whites plus rose liqueur, sugar. Break it all well and pour over the pancakes. Add coal to the fire. Cover the pancakes and put them on the fire to brown them. Of course, it was an aristocratic recipe. Actually, there are many records and citations, and I would really bore you reading it all. But I have to read you an account of an Englishman, Burnet, from 1807, who reported the Poles have also a peculiar vegetable which they call manna, which I am ashamed to mention, as I know not its natural history. In appearance, when brought to table, is granular, the grains being probably about the size of grits, though perhaps somewhat fuller. They are certainly not so large as barleycorns after the husk is taken away. This vegetable is fried and eaten by itself, as almost everything else. An unpracticed taste would not like it. If one may be allowed a conjectural resemblance to distinct and original taste, which has never been experienced, I should be disposed to liken it to barley without the husk and fried in bacon fat. Actually, not too bad. We also have records of manna being used in Germany, in Czechia, in Hungary, but no records beyond the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the east. So this was more like a Central European food. And we have manna in a Polish edition of a cookbook which was very popular in Brandenburg in Germany, whose author is Sophie Wilhelmine Scheibler. And she explains, this is 1815, millet or manna with milk. Apply boiling water a few times to millet, and if they are very floury, first rinse them with warm water and then with hot, eventually with cold water, so that they become clean. Then boil in water, because if they are put straight away into milk, they became too soft like rice. Only then put them into milk and boil until they attain the desired density. Before serving, they should be salted a little, and having been poured into a pot, shake with sugar and cinnamon. Boil manna in the same fashion, but check that it doesn't stick more than you do with millet. The last recipe for manna in a Polish cookbook appears in 1860 in a cookbook by Lucyna Ćwierczakiewiczowa, who writes, "The real manna is so rare that very few people know the way of preparing it." Already at the end of the 19th century, this was my comment. I read further. Manna is gathered in meadows before dawn on some marked days in spring. Manna has a gray color, so it should be rinsed with running water until the water is clear. Then, when still wet, it should be mixed with eggs and straightway put into boiling unskimmed milk, taking just below half a quarter of milk, or for a quarter of milk. It's very good for pudding, but then take, after rinsing and mixing with eggs, a quarter of manna to a quarter of milk, add a spoonful of fresh butter, salt, and boil at least an hour until it becomes completely dissolved. When served, spray richly with sugar and cinnamon, and on the sugar pour fresh butter with browned crumbs. One can also add, at the end of cooking, some Turkish raisins. And so manna was a dessert food, was quite expensive, was liked, had a good reputation. And now in Polish we have a food product called kasha manna, which means manna groats. And I suppose it has something to do with manna grass, because at some point Jewish merchants would try to forge manna, which was expensive, and they would break the grains of wheat and sell them as a product called manna. So kasha manna, this wheat groats, is actually it has linguistic origins with manna grass. We don't know exactly when people stopped collecting manna grass. I mean, at the end of the 19th century, it was already a kind of curiosity. So the thing that really brought it to the end was the end of feudalism, when peasants stopped having to pay tributes to the lords. So the second half of the 19th century, but also the drainage of marshes, because it's a kind of plant of very wet meadows and pond edges, and then bans on trampling meadows, and also the general change in the diet, and the disappearance of wild foods, although some famine foods were still very popular at the end of the 19th century. So then in the records from the 20th century, it's mainly talked about as something which is not practiced anymore, although we do have some records that it was occasionally gathered until 1940s on the eastern edges of Poland. Maybe some individuals collected later, but it would be really interesting to find out. What amazes me that it's enough to have a few generations and people completely forget about such an important, widely known food. This was widely known in 18th century probably, and then even in parts of Poland in the 19th century. And then now, if you stop in the street and ask 1,000 people, no one ever heard about it here. I would also be very happy if you subscribe to my Wild Food Ethnobotanical channel, because it gives me more energy to produce more videos. The more I see that people actually listen to me and it gives them interesting information, it gives me energy to make new videos.